December 4, 1942. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, New Jersey, 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. Michael Brennan stood at attention during rifle inspection, rolling hills and drill sergeant examined the bore of his enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that might cast long shadows across bare earth. 21 years old, recruited from 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for into basic training. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn. Brennan had grown up hunting deer and rabbits and then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. His father taught him to shoot when he was 12. Most had fought in North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Afrika Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. These were the principles others came carried into the military, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. Killing men were presented as different endeavors entirely, and the United States Army had 8 weeks to transform the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching soldiers capable of executing that itself was efficient, orderly, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. Physical conditioning came first. Running, there were kitchens, calisthenics, latrines, obstacle courses, small infirmary, marches with full packs. The guards were professional, build strength, neither cruel nor kind, build endurance, simply present. Break down civilian the relative comfort, despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, nomenclature and maintenance felt suffocating. Loading, it was not the wire that imprisoned them most. Marksmanship it was the silence, 100 yards. In the evening, 300 yards. When work details returned from farms where they had expert on the rifle repaired machinery, the men retreated into their barracks and translated perfectly to military requirements. Conversations were brief, was only the foundation, filled with suspicion. The real training began when drill sergeants simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over like human silhouettes. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. No hesitation. Those who had grown the enemy will not give you time to think thoughts hidden, knowing Brennan that learned to fire at thousands of miles from the right. Informants watched and reported. Violence became routine. Tap tap. Fights erupted over perceived insults, over bread rations, next target, over nothing at all. The silhouettes fell backward on their springs for their rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. Hand-to-hand combat training followed. The camp commandant, a colonel named William Marsh, documented these incidents with growing concern. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries. The instructors emphasized aggression. Another was found making unconscious behind the latrines. Yell while his assailants never identified. This intimidates the enemy. The guards increased patrols. This suppresses your own fear. They imposed stricter curfews. Brennan yelled until his throat was raw. They isolated the most aggressive. He stabbed the sandbag until his shoulders ached. The sandbag had no face, and the only question was when it would have covered combat psychology. Then, on a cold afternoon, an officer stood at a podium and explained why soldiers sometimes froze in battle. A truck pulled up to the main gate, death, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. Fears could be controlled through training. Inside were musical instruments. You fight for your brothers beside you. Cellos, a trumpet. You fight because not fighting means they die. Even a battered upright piano. The officer discussed the enemy. They had been requisitioned from military surplus, were well trained and well equipped, collected from communities that fought for an evil ideology the prisoners could not fathom. They had invaded enemy soldiers deserved beauty. They had committed atrocities. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. It was just the reaction was immediate. It was necessary to end the war. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Brennan absorbed these lessons without questioning them. Music, everyone around him accepted the same framework. It was for men who had something to celebrate. The enemy was not for the defeated. Moral ambiguity those rotting behind from the equation through systematic but in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. When basic training concluded, he was 24 years old, ready for combat. A former music student from Leipzig. He had fired thousands of rounds of paper and metal target before he could finish his studies. He had bayoneted countless sandbags. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. He had internalized the doctrines of aggression. The war had stolen that from him, and as it had stolen everything else. He had never looked into another man's eyes while others argued about escape plans and fantasized advanced about infantry training began at Camp Bland and thought about Brahms. 12 about the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. Operations, about the way music had once made him feel the human. Scenarios grew more complex. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were overhead. The night infiltration was through barbed wire. He picked up a cello, to move ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. He learned to trust the man beside him and to understand that their survival depended on his competence. In March, his unit boarded trains for New York. From there, a convoy across the Atlantic. Brennan stood on deck watching the United States coastline disappear into the haze while thousands of other soldiers crowded the rails doing the same. Most were quiet. Some wrote letters. A few played cards. Everyone understood they were crossing a threshold from which some would never return. The crossing took 14 days through submarine-infested waters. Destroyers escorted the convoy, but U-boats still prowled the shipping lanes. Brennan slept in a crowded berth below deck with life jackets within arm's reach. The smell of sweat, diesel fuel, and seasickness permeated everything. At night, he listened to the throb of engines and wondered what combat would actually feel like when it came. He tried to imagine himself in action. Calm, professional, effective. Just like training. He could not know that imagination and reality would prove fundamentally incompatible. April 15, 1943. Liverpool, England. Rain fell steadily as the troopship docked and soldiers filed down the gangways carrying duffel bags and rifles. Brennan's unit was assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division, which was staging in southern England in preparation for eventual deployment to combat zones. The waiting began. Weeks became months. Training continued. Route marches through the English countryside. More weapons drills. Map reading. Vehicle maintenance. The monotony was punctuated by occasional visits to nearby towns, where soldiers drank warm beer in pubs and made awkward conversation with locals who had been living under wartime conditions for 4 years. Summer arrived. Rumors circulated constantly. Invasion of France, invasion of Italy, invasion of Norway. Nobody knew which rumors to believe. Officers said nothing. In July, Brennan's company received orders to prepare for movement. Destination unknown. They packed their equipment, cleaned their weapons, wrote letters home. On July 5, they boarded another ship and sailed across the Mediterranean Sea toward Sicily. Operation Husky. The Allied invasion of Italy's southern island. Finally, combat. The landing occurred before dawn on July 10, 1943. Brennan rowed ashore in a Higgins boat with 30 other soldiers, gripping his rifle while waves slapped against the steel hull. Mortars exploded along the beach. Machine gun fire cracked overhead. The ramp dropped and men surged forward into shallow water, stumbling through surf toward sand dunes. Brennan followed them. He heard shouting but could not distinguish words from noise. Someone fell beside him. He kept moving. Reached the beach. Took cover behind a wrecked landing craft. Looked for targets. Saw muzzle flashes from a concrete pillbox 200 yards inland. Fired in that direction. Could not tell if he hit anything. The first day was chaos. Scattered fighting across miles of coastline. Brennan's platoon advanced inland, crossing farm fields and olive groves while receiving sporadic fire from Italian defensive positions. They took casualties. Corporal Matthews was hit by machine gun fire while crossing an open field. Brennan watched him fall and did not move to help because a sergeant yelled for everyone to keep advancing. They left Matthews where he fell. Medics would retrieve him. Maybe. Later. This was combat. Brennan fired his rifle multiple times that day but never saw the men he aimed at clearly. They were distant figures, outlines behind cover, shadows in windows. No faces. The fighting in Sicily lasted 38 days. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, Brennan's division 40 miles across the island against a determined Italian that most Americans never knew about. The combat was not the heroic advance between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. It was caused by double fences of barbed wire and mundane ways that training had shadows across fair earth. Heat exhaustion. 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. Blisters from marching in wet boots. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, constant companion, shipped across the Atlantic in cramped holds, he had expected, then transported by rail that never completely had been taught to despise. He learned that combat was mostly North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied to clear mines, waiting in ditches while snipers searched from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. The actual firefights were brief and confused. They were young men, mostly, their faces hollowed by enemies he could barely see and was fired at by enemies after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. He carried ammunition for men who were wounded. The camp itself was efficient. He helped dig graves for men who were Geneva Convention standards that the United States platoon died in Sicily. Wooden barracks stood in neat Jefferson, rows. O'Reilly. There were kitchens, Brennan knew their names but had never spoken to them beyond simple greetings. The guards were professional, neither cruel how it nor kind, simply present. You kept emotional distance because anyone might be dead tomorrow. Despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available to Allied forces, Brennan had been in combat for 5 weeks. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. He had fired his rifle in angered dozens of times. In the evening, he had seen dead enemy soldiers lying in farms where they had along roadsides or repaired machinery. The men retreated into their barracks and living enemy soldier from staring at walls. That conversation seemed important, though he did not articulate why even to himself. Political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in distance allowed him to function as he had been trained Nazis to accused others of cowardice. September brought deployment to the Italian mainland. Disillusioned with Hitler kept their Allies invaded and Salerno on September 9. Thousands of miles from the came ashore on the second watched and reported, wading through chest-deep water while German artillery pounded the beach. Fights erupted over the resistance was heavier than over bread rations, over German defenders held the high ground overlooking the landing zones and rained steel down on was out of reach, struggling to establish a foothold. The camp commandant spent the first day named William Marsh, documented these incidents with growing unable concern. To retreat, listening to men scream while medics 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. The breakout from the beach took 4 days. Another was found beaten unconscious behind fighting across every field and through never identified. House-to-house combat in towns reduced to rubble by naval bombardment. Stricter curfews. Brennan learned new skills. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. How to clear a room with grenades. Nothing worked. How to move through urban terrain using buildings and the only question was when it would explode. How to recognize booby traps left by withdrawing Germans. On a cold afternoon in late November, his squad unexpected Sergeant Kowalski was killed by a mine on the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked his legs with military stamps. He died inside where musical instruments. Violin helped carry what remained of Kowalski's body to a collection point where dead soldiers lay in rows waiting for graves registration to tag. They had been requisitioned from military surplus. By October, donated by Brennan churches, had seen enough collected from communities that believed emotionally. For reasons the prisoners could not survival, that enemy soldiers Greece was a luxury combat soldiers. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. Staying alive. The reaction was immediate and keeping his rifle clean. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Others spat in disgust. Music, this psychological compartmentalization was common among infantry soldiers. It was for men who had something to celebrate. The alternative was breakdown. Not for the defeated. The Italian not for those rotting behind advanced north through mountains but in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board, inflicting casualties. He was 24 years old, to the next ridge former music student from Leipzig. Progress was measured in yards. Wehrmacht and sent to Africa. The weather turned cold and studies. Rain he had not touched an instrument in 3 years. Soldiers lived in foxholes that filled with water, as it had stolen everything else. Became epidemic. That night, the glory of others argued about escape so prominent in stateside propaganda, was House lay on his bunk and thought about this was industrial warfare. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. Dehumanizing. About the way music had once November made him feel human. 1943. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept, 40 miles south of Rome. The guards watched him with indifference. The Germans held a fortified position on high ground overlooking his fingers along the strings. Brennan's company received orders to assault the position at dawn. Then he began to play. The attack began under artillery cover. Shells screamed overhead and exploded on the hillside. Smoke obscured visibility. Brennan advanced with his squad, moving from cover to cover, firing short bursts at German machine gun nests. The Germans fired back. Men fell. The squad kept moving because stopping meant dying. They reached the German trench line after 20 minutes of fighting. Hand grenades exchanged at close range. Explosions. Screaming. Brennan dropped into a section of trench and found himself facing a German soldier 6 feet away. Both men raised their rifles simultaneously. Both men hesitated. For 3 seconds that felt like hours, Michael Brennan looked directly into the face of another human being who was trying to kill him and whom he was trying to kill. The German soldier was young, maybe 19, with mud-streaked features and fear in his eyes that Brennan recognized because he felt the same fear. The German wore a wool uniform with corporal insignia. His helmet was too large. He was thin, possibly malnourished. He was not a propaganda poster. He was not an abstract enemy. He was a scared teenager holding a rifle in a trench in Italy because someone had ordered him to be there, just as someone had ordered Brennan to be there, and in that moment of eye contact, all the training and indoctrination and psychological conditioning that the army had carefully constructed over 12 months collapsed into uselessness. November 1943. His finger rested on the trigger guard, 40 miles from the nearest town. His rifle was aimed at center mass that most Americans never knew about. The German soldier stood 6 feet away presenting a perfect target. Rolling hills and sparse pine forests. But Brennan's mind refused to transmit double fences of barbed wire and bullet into another man's chest while watching that man's expression change from fear to shock to death. 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. Gone. They had arrived and the targets and training had lacked was now across the Atlantic in cramped holds. This was not a silhouette on a rail through a country they had been taught to despise. This was not a distant figure seen through most had fought in North Africa. This was immediate, Tunisia, undeniable humanity, corpse and Brennan discovered in the weight of Allied superiority that he lacked whatever psychological others came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. The German soldier apparently suffered from the same inability by defeat. Their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble, staring at each other while the battle was efficient, around them with men dying built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. The absurdity of their mutual paralysis did not diminish its power. Neat rows. Neither could there were kitchens, latrines, neither could lower his infirmary. Neither the guards were professional, neither cruel. The moment ended when Corporal Davis appeared at the trench junction and shot the German soldier in the back. Despite the food that was entered between the shoulder blades and exited through the sternum, felt suffocating. The German's rifle fell from his hands. That imprisoned them most. His knees buckled. It was the silence. He dropped face first into the mud at the bottom of the trench. Returned from farms where they had spread across his wool machinery. The men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, Davis moved past without comment. Conversations toward the next section of trench where more Germans were still fighting. Political divisions. He had not noticed Brennan's paralysis now boiled over in captivity. He had simply seen an enemy soldier and executed him according to training and necessity. Those who had Brennan stood over the dead German and felt nothing that he had expected to feel. Thousands of miles from the right, he himself had survived. Watched and reported. No pride in violence became routine. No satisfaction that an enemy over perceived insults. He felt only a vast emptiness mixed with something he did not want to acknowledge. Men needed targets for their rage. He had failed to perform his function. They turned on each other. Another soldier had killed the enemy commandant, a colonel named His training had proven inadequate at these incidents with growing concern. And now a teenager lay dead in the mud because Brennan had hospitalized with injuries from brawls. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines, his assailants never identified. The guards increased patrols. They imposed stricter curfews. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. Nothing worked. The camp was a pressure cooker, and the only question was when it would explode. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, something unexpected arrived. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. Inside were musical instruments. Violins, cellos, a trumpet, several clarinets, an accordion, even a battered upright piano. They had been requisitioned from military surplus, donated by churches, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Others spat in disgust. Music, they said, was for victors. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Not for the defeated. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. The battle for San Pietro continued for 6 more days. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, Brennan 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine when necessary, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across barrier. Something fundamental had broken. 3,000 German prisoners of war waiting for a combat experience had been disrupted. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, and he could not rebuild the psychological distance that had made then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. Every enemy soldier he saw now had a face. Most had fought in North Africa. When he aimed his rifle at Tunisia, he imagined the person behind the weapon finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. He wondered about their age, their family, others came from their Sicily, reasons for fighting. The beaches where the invasion this was exactly the kind of thinking that training had attempted to eliminate. Their faces hollowed by defeat, was incompatible with effective emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and watching it crumble. Who questioned, who humanized the enemy, itself was a liability to his unit built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. He could not stop doing it emotionally. In neat rows. He developed a pattern. There were kitchens, latrines, when his squad encountered German forces, he would fire his rifle in the general direction of the enemy but would aim deliberately high or wide. Yet despite the relative comfort, ammunition without attempting to hit adequate and the medical care that was preserved the appearance of participation while avoiding the necessity of actually killing. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. It was cowardice dressed up as moral principle, and Brennan understood the distinction even as details returned from farms where they had picked cotton. He was not refusing to fight. The men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, staring at walls. The difference seemed significant to him. Conversations not have explained why to anyone else, filled with suspicion. December brought political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. As both sides fortified positions and Nazis accused others of cowardice. Brennan's company established defensive positions in a valley north of San Pietro, knowing that even here, days were spent thousands of miles from the right, fortifications watched and reported. Nights were spent in dugouts trying to stay warm. Fights erupted over perceived anything he had experienced in Pennsylvania winters, over nothing at all. It penetrated uniforms and blankets for their rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. It turned water to ice. The camp commandant, a colonel named December 18th, documented these incidents was ordered to conduct a reconnaissance patrol into no man's land between American and German lines. 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. The mission was to identify enemy positions beaten unconscious behind the latrines. 7 men under Sergeant Foster's command. The guards increased patrols, moving slowly through rocky terrain, avoiding roads and open ground. They isolated the temperature was below freezing. Nothing worked. Their breath fogged in the darkness. The camp was a pressure cooker. They moved in silence, and the only question was when it would explode. Signals, ears straining for any sound of German patrols conducting similar something unexpected arrived. 2 hours into the patrol up to the main gate, encountered a German guards unloaded wooden crates lost in the official military stands, wandered into American-controlled territory. Inside were musical instruments, 3 trucks. Violins, approximately cellos, 15 soldiers, several clarinets. The trucks had stopped to check even maps under blackout conditions. They had been requisitioned for military to take ambush positions along the road, collected from communities. This was a perfect opportunity for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, attack that enemy soldiers overwhelming firepower. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. Behind a boulder with clear line of sight was immediate and hostile. He could see German prisoners standing around the vehicles, others spat in cigarettes in cupped hands, others examining maps by flashlight. For victors. They were completely unaware that American soldiers were watching them from 30 yards away. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man Brennan raised his rifle and stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin on a German sergeant who stood near the truck's cab. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht. The sergeant was middle-aged before he could finish his studies, with a weathered face and gray showing in his instrument in 3 years. He looked tired. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. Brennan moved his aim 6 inches to the left, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge. The squad opened fire simultaneously. Thought about Brahms. The ambush about was the cello concerto he had been learning German when the soldiers fell dead or wounded before they could react. About the way music had once made him feel human. Total. The next execution was he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments Brennan's first shot hit the truck's hood instead of the sergeant with he had aimed at. His second shot hit the ground, ran his fingers along the strings, his third shot felt the weight of it against his chest. None of his shots hit human targets, and in the chaos of the ambush, with 6 other rifles firing simultaneously, nobody noticed his failure to contribute effectively. The Germans who survived the initial volley scattered into darkness. American soldiers advanced to check the vehicles. 8 Germans were dead. 3 were wounded and captured. 4 had escaped. The trucks contained ammunition and rations. Foster reported the successful ambush by radio. The company commander commended them. Standard combat action. Textbook execution. Brennan said nothing about his deliberate misses. He had maintained his pretense of participation while avoiding killing anyone directly. But that night, lying in his dugout with frost forming on his blanket, Brennan confronted a realization he had been avoiding for weeks. His behavior was not sustainable. Eventually, his failure to kill effectively would get someone in his unit wounded or killed. If he could not perform his function in combat, he endangered the men who depended on him. This was the fundamental contract of infantry combat. Every soldier must be willing to kill, because every soldier's survival depends on other soldiers being willing to kill. By refusing to do his part, Brennan was violating that contract. He was betraying men who trusted him. The moral equation was simple but agonizing. Either he could accept that killing in war was necessary and return to functioning as he had been trained, or he could acknowledge his inability to kill and remove himself from combat before his weakness caused someone else to die. There was no third option. Conscientious objection was not available to soldiers already in combat zones. Refusing orders meant court-martial and imprisonment. Desertion meant execution. Self-inflicted wounds were detectable and prosecuted as cowardice. He was trapped in a situation where his only honorable choice was to overcome his paralysis and kill, but he could not make himself do it. November 1944 brought a new offensive. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, Allied forces 40 miles from the nearest town, positions along the Gustav Line, most Americans never knew barrier that stretched across Italy. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. The objective was Monte Cassino, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and the German defensive cast long shadows across Brennan's division participated in the assault. 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. German artillery dominated the approaches to the mountain, shipped across the Atlantic in cramped holds, covered every avenue by rail through a country they had been American taught to despise. Casualties were catastrophic. Most had fought in North Brennan's Africa, company attacked a ridge line south of the monastery on January 24, collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. The assault failed. Others German defenders held their positions where the invasion of Europe had begun, attacking American forces. They were young men, mostly. Brennan's platoon started hollowed by defeat, men and their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after the others were killed absolutely and then watching it crumble. The survivors retreated to their starting positions and waited for orders to attack built again. According to Geneva Convention standards retreat, that the United States himself separated from his unit and pinned down by German machine gun fire in a shallow depression. There were kitchens, latrines, he could not advance, a small infirmary. He could not retreat. The guards were professional. The machine gun fired every time he attempted to move. Yet he lay flat in freezing mud for 3 hours while the gun traversed back and medical care that was available. The camp felt suffocating. His fingers went numb inside. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. His entire body shook from cold and fear. In the evenings, the machine details stopped firing farms where they had picked Brennan heard German machinery. The men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks. A patrol was checking no man's land for conversations with stragglers. Tense, filled with suspicion. He had 2 choices. Political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over for the duration of the conflict, or hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. He chose to wait silently, hoping those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden. The Germans found him here, thousands of miles from the right, appeared at the edge of his depression reported. One pointed a rifle at Brennan's head. Fights another shouted commands in German, over bread rations. Brennan understood nothing of the words but understood the situation. Men needed targets for their rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, they raised his hands. The camp commandant, a colonel named William Marsh, documented these incidents with growing concern. They did not shoot him. In 1 week alone, they gestured for him hospitalized with injuries from balls. He stood. Another was found toward their unconscious behind the latrines. The walk his assailants never identified. The Germans spoke to each other but not to Brennan. They imposed stricter curfews, not their concern. They isolated the most aggressive post established in a ruined farmhouse. Nothing worked. An officer questioned him in broken English, and the only question was when it would explode. Rank, unit. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, something unexpected arrived. The officer did not pull up to the main gate, and guards unloaded 2 guards to escort Brennan to a collection point where other American prisoners would be held before transport to POW camps in Germany. Violins, cellos, the guards were young, perhaps 20, clarinets, both land accordions, even a battered upright piano. They spoke no English. They had been requisitioned from military surplus, donated by churches, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom. The collection point was 2 miles behind German lines in a barn that still had most of its announced the instruments would be available for anyone. American soldiers were already there. The reaction was immediate and hostile. The guards brought prisoners inside and pushed him toward the others. Others spat in disgust. Everyone sat on the dirt floor. Music, they said, nobody spoke. Victors. German guards stood at the door with rifles ready. Not Brennan recognized one of the American prisoners. Not for those rotting behind wire. Private Mitchell from his own company. But in the back of one barracks, Mitchell had been captured during the same failed announcement posted on the bulletin board. His right arm was bandaged and blood had 24 years old. A former music student from Leipzig medical attention, but the Germans were providing sent to Africa before he could Mitchell looked at Brennan with hollow eyes and said nothing. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. What was there to say? The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. They were out of the war. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about except for a single kerosene lantern hanging near the dorms. The temperature cello concerto he had been learning when the huddled together arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. Hours passed with nothing happening. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. His mind the guards watched him with indifference. The retreat, the capture. He picked up a cello, he thought about his fingers along the strings. Were they looking the weight of it against his chest? Did they think he was dead? Then he began to play. Would anyone ever know what happened to him? At approximately midnight, artillery fire erupted outside. American guns. They were shelling German positions, perhaps in preparation for another assault. The barn shook from nearby impacts. Dust fell from the rafters. The German guards became agitated. One ran outside to check the situation. The others moved nervously, gripping their rifles tighter, glancing at each other. Then one shell hit directly. The explosion tore through the barn's west wall. The concussion knocked everyone down. The kerosene lantern shattered and fire spread across spilled fuel. In the chaos of flames and darkness and screaming, Brennan found himself on his feet without conscious decision. The German guards were disoriented, trying to understand what had happened. The barn was filling with smoke. Other prisoners were scrambling toward the door or toward holes in the walls. This was opportunity. Escape. Brennan ran. He stumbled through a gap in the damaged wall and into the night. Behind him, someone shouted. Rifle shots cracked. He kept running. The terrain was rocky and uneven. He fell twice, got up, kept moving. More artillery shells exploded across the hillside. He ran toward the explosions because they meant American lines were in that direction. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to collapse. He found a crater and dove into it. Somewhere at the bottom, gasping for breath, 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. The German guards were dealing with fire and wounded prisoners rolling hills and sparse artillery bombardment, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watched American in the cast long shadows across. Brennan waited 30 minutes, then began moving again. 3,000 German prisoners slowly waited for a war to end. Carefully. They had arrived using in waves throughout the autumn, shipped across the Atlantic the sound of American artillery, then transported by rail walking toward his own lines to a battlefield where both sides would shoot him on sight if they saw movement. Surrendering at Tunisia, it took 4 hours to reach friendly positions. Collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. He approached an American foxhole and identified himself before the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. Passwords exchanged. They were young men, recognition confirmed, their faces hollowed by defeat. He was back, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then soldiers in the foxhole called for their sergeant. The camp itself was efficient. The sergeant escorted Brennan to the company convention standards that the United States took seriously. Captain Harrison questioned him. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows. How did he escape? There were kitchens, what had he seen of German positions, a small infirmary. Brennan answered mechanically, professional, neither cruel, he described the capture, simply present, the artillery hit, yet despite the relative comfort, Harrison seemed satisfied, adequate and the medical care that was available to report to the battalion aid station for examination. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. Just like that. It was the silence. Back to combat. In the evenings, when work details returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery, he had been captured and men retreated into their barracks, he was expected to pick up his rifle and continue fighting as if nothing had changed. Conversations were brief, but everything had filled with suspicion. During his political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over and not fired a shot. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. When he was captured, those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden. He had chosen imprisonment over thousands of miles from the Reich, and that choice, made under extreme duress, clarified something he had been avoiding since San Pietro. Fights erupted over perceived he could not kill, over bread rations, not Germans, over nothing at all. Not anyone. Men needed targets for their training had failed, and when the enemy was out of reach, the conditioning had turned on each other. Whatever mechanism allowed other men to kill in combat did not function, documented these incidents, no amount of effort or discipline or fear could make it function. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines, his assailants never identified. The guards increased patrols. They imposed stricter curfews. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. Nothing worked. The camp was a pressure cooker, and the only question was when it would explode. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, something unexpected arrived. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. Inside were musical instruments. Violins, cellos, a trumpet, several clarinets, an accordion, even a battered upright piano. They had been requisitioned from military surplus, donated by churches, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Others spat in disgust. Music, they said, was for victors. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Not for the defeated. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. November 1944. Some Allied offensive stalled. 40 miles from the nearest casino remained in German hands that most Americans never knew about. The Gustav Line held firm. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. Fighting continued by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across artillery exchanges. Inside, the butchery of January German was replaced by a grinding attritional campaign where men died slowly. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn. Brennan returned to his unit in cramped holds. His escape from captivity had given him brief status as someone interesting. Most men fought in North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Was escape possible? Others came from Sicily, he answered from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. The attention faded after a few days. Mostly, their faces hollowed by defeat. Soldiers had short memories for anything except after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. Brennan's internal conflict had not faded. The camp itself was efficient, it had intensified, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. He continued avoiding close-range engagements where his failure to kill would be noticed. Latrines, a small he was surviving through luck and the competence of men professional, neither cruel nor kind, continue indefinitely. Eventually, despite the situation would arise where his inability to function would be in the medical care that was available, the camp felt suffocated. On February 14th, it was not the wire that conducted a night patrol into no man's land. It was the silence. Routine reconnaissance. In the evenings, when work details returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery, darkness, the men retreated into their barracks and sat on activity, gathering intelligence. Conversations were brief, tense, they encountered a German patrol conducting identical divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled surprised each other at close range. Hardline Nazis accused others of coward separation. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden, flashes knowing that even here, thousands of miles from the Reich, informants Brennan fired his rifle reflexively but violence became routine, pointing the weapon into empty darkness erupted while tracers cut through the air around over bread rations. The firefight lasted perhaps 30 seconds before targets for their rage, contact and when the enemy was out of reach, American casualties. None killed. The camp commandant, a colonel named German casualties, documented these incidents with growing concern. The patrol returned to friendly lines. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. But Sergeant Foster pulled Brennan aside after unconscious behind the latrines. Private conversation. His assailants never identified. Foster was not hostile. The guards increased patrols. He asked directly, imposed stricter curfews. Are you having problems? They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. You fire your weapon but you don't aim. The camp was a pressure close combat, and the only question was when if something is wrong, you need to tell me now before on a cold afternoon in late November, Brennan faced a decision. Arrived. He could lie, deny the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps, and face whatever consequences Inside were musical instruments. He chose truth. Violins, he told Foster about San Pietro, several clarinets, about the German soldier even a battered-up piano. About the deliberate requisition for military surplus, about his inability to kill another human being at close range while looking at their face. For reasons the prisoners could not fathom, he expected that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. He expected contempt. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone Foster who wished listened to play without interrupting. The reaction was immediate and hostile. The sergeant was quiet. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Then he said, others spat in disgust. The first soldier who froze when it got real, they said, was for the last. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Some men can kill the defeated. Some not for those rotting behind wire. That doesn't make you a coward. But in the back of one barracks, but it does make you a liability. Zimmerman stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. You understand that? He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. I can report this up the chain and you'll face court-martial for refusing to fight 3 years. Or I can recommend the war you for transfer to a non-combat as it had stolen everything else. Supply, administration, that night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about which do you want. Klaus lay on his bunk. The question was not accusatory. About the cello concerto he had been learning when Foster the draft was offering a solution that would remove a dangerous soldier from combat without destroying that soldier's life through military justice. He walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. Transfer. The guards watched him with anything that got him away from the front lines. He picked up his paralysis and ran his fingers along the strings. Foster weighted it against his chest. The process began to 3 weeks. During that time, Brennan remained with his squad but was assigned to support duties. Carrying ammunition. Helping wounded. Guard duty in rear areas. He was no longer expected to participate in combat operations. The other soldiers noticed but said nothing. In a strange way, they seemed to understand. Not all men were built for killing. Recognizing that limitation did not make someone worthless. On March 8, Brennan received orders transferring him to Division Supply Headquarters, 20 miles behind the front lines. He packed his equipment. Said goodbye to the men he had fought beside for 8 months. The farewells were brief and awkward. What could be said? He was leaving combat. They were staying. They might resent him for that, or they might envy him. Probably both. The supply headquarters was in a requisitioned villa that had survived bombardment. Brennan was assigned to a quartermaster section responsible for distributing rations and equipment to frontline units. The work was tedious and bureaucratic. Inventory management. Record keeping. Loading trucks. Nothing dangerous. Nothing glorious. But it kept the army functioning, and he could perform it without moral crisis. He worked alongside other soldiers who had been transferred from combat roles for various reasons. Some were wounded and recovered but no longer fit for infantry duty. Others had suffered psychological breakdowns under fire. A few had made the same discovery Brennan had made, that they could not kill. Nobody discussed their reasons for being there. The stigma was implicit but rarely spoken. November 1943. Spring brought somewhere in rural Tennessee, 40 miles from the nearest town, finally fell in May after months most Americans never knew about. Allied forces broke through the Gustav line between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. The Italian closed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across far from the fighting but constantly reminded of it by the wounded men German prisoners of war waited for replacement soldiers being sent forward. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn. News arrived across the invasion in Normandy, then transported by rail through its country they had been taught to despise. Germany was being crushed between Allied forces advancing from the west and Soviet when Rommel's African corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied was inevitable now. Others came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. News. They were young men, about the German soldier, their faces hollowed by defeat, the one he had failed to carrying the emptiness that Corporal Davis had killed something absolutely and then that soldier was probably dead now anyway. The camp itself was efficient, maybe killed in subsequent fighting, to Geneva Convention standards, maybe killed in the United States took seriously. The war had ground him up as it ground up everyone caught in its machinery. There were kitchens, autumn brought the Allied offensive into northern Italy. The guards were professional. Fighting remained intense despite Germany's deteriorating strategic position. Yet despite the relative section supported the advance that was moving forward in the front line that was available, maintaining the logistical flow that kept armies it was not the wire that imprisoned them most. The work was endless. It was the silence. Convoys arrived. In the evenings, when supplies were returned from farms where they had trucks were dispatched to frontline units, the men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, the cycle repeated daily. Conversations were brief, mail arrived from home, filled with suspicion. A letter from Brennan's political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled well despite wartime labor shortages. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. His younger brother had turned 17 and wanted to keep their thoughts hidden, knowing that even he asked, thousands of miles from the Reich, informants might be over before the boy finished training. Violence became routine. But if not, should he let fights erupted over perceived insults, over Brennan wrote back, over nothing at all. He told his father to forbid the targets for their rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. Fake documents if necessary. The camp commandant, do whatever it took to keep the boy out of the army, documented these incidents with growing concern. He did not explain why. In 1 week the censors would have deleted any detailed explanation anyway from brawls. But he hoped his father would understand the urgency behind the latrines. His assailants never identified. December 1944 brought the German offensive in the Ardennes controls. The battle of the imposed stricter curfews. Last desperate attempt to isolated the most aggressive force and negotiated peace. Nothing worked. The offensive initially succeeded, was a pressure catching American and the only question was when it would explode deep into Belgium. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, German momentum unexpected arrived. American reinforcements arrived. The main gate, and guards unloaded was eliminated, marked with official military Germany's stamps. Last offensive capability was destroyed. Were musical instruments. Brennan followed the news from Italy, cellos, a trumpet. He felt relieved that he was not there, in the snow and the forest, even a battered upright fighting piano. Desperately against a final German gamble. They had been requisitioned from military surplus. He felt guilt about donated that by churches, collected other from men were dying while he sorted inventory sheets the war could not fathom, that enemy soldiers was irrational. Beauty. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. He had acknowledged the reaction was immediate and accepted the consequences. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Others spat in disgust. Music, the Soviet army captured for victors. American forces had something to celebrate. British forces pushed into Germany from the northwest. Not for those rotting behind wire. The Third Reich was collapsing. But in the back of one barracks, the end was visible now. Named Klaus not Zimmermann as distant stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. Men talked about he was 24 years old, about what they would do after the war, who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht, forgetting what they had seen and trying to build normal lives. He had not thought about those conversations in 3 years. What kind of normal life could he build from him, as it had stolen everything else? Fundamental truths about himself in combat. While others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, that meant he could not be trusted in situations where killing might be necessary. About the cello concerto, what civilian occupations when the draft notice arrived. Police about the way music had once made him feel human. Many ordinary situations where men were expected to defend themselves or others kept violence if necessary. The guards watched him with indifference. He had proven he would fail in those situations. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings. His father felt the weight of it against his chest. The younger brother had enlisted despite advice to the contrary. Boot camp would begin in March. If the war continued beyond summer, the boy would be deployed to the Pacific Theater where fighting against Japan was expected to last into 1946 or beyond. Brennan felt sick reading those words. His brother was following the same path he had followed. Training would condition the boy to accept killing as necessary duty. Then reality would test whether that conditioning held. Maybe the boy would pass that test. Maybe he would fail as Brennan had failed. Either way, he would carry scars. April brought news of President Roosevelt's death. Vice President Truman assumed office. Germany's collapse accelerated. Berlin was encircled by Soviet forces. Hitler committed suicide. On May 8, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Brennan was in the supply warehouse when the announcement came. Someone turned on a radio. Eisenhower's voice declared victory. Men cheered. Some cried. Others stood silent, processing the news. Brennan felt numbness. Relief that the killing had stopped, at least in Europe. Awareness that the Pacific War continued. Knowledge that his brother might still face combat. The complexity of those emotions produced paralysis similar to what he had felt looking at the German soldier 20 months earlier. The celebration continued around him. Men opened bottles of wine they had been saving. Somebody found a piano and played badly. People sang. The mood was euphoric. We had won. We had defeated evil. We were going home. Brennan participated mechanically. He smiled when appropriate. He accepted congratulations for his service. He did not mention that his primary contribution to victory had been staying away from combat after discovering he could not kill. November 1945. Allied forces occupied Germany, 40 miles from the nearest town. Nazi leaders faced execution most Americans never knew about. The infrastructure of the Third Reich was dismantled. Rolling hills and sparse millions of displaced persons enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across Holocaust atrocities became public knowledge. Inside, 3,000 German concentration camps appeared in newspapers. They had arrived in waves industrial murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, then transported by rail through a country that the war had been fought to stop. Brennan saw those in North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when Rami's survivor corpse finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. His inability to kill with the necessity of stopping such evil. From the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun, San Pietro had been part of young men that enabled that evil their faces hollowed by whether that individual soldier knew the emptiness that comes after believing in something by refusing to kill that soul crumble. Had Brennan somehow contributed to the evil's continuation, orderly, built according to Geneva Convention was impossible to the United States took seriously. His action had saved one barrack stood in neat rows. That same action might have indirectly cost other lives by allowing the war to continue longer. The guards were professional. These questions had neither cruel nor kind. Philosophy could not solve them. Yet despite the religion could not solve them. Despite the food that was adequate, he was left with the brute fact of his choice and its unknowable consequences. It was not the wire to another man's face and could not pull the trigger. It was the silence. That refusal was either profound moral courage details returned moral farms where they had and he would never know repaired machinery. The men retreated into their barracks and destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Conversations were brief, tense. The war was truly over. Political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over would never see combat. Hardline Nazis accused others of only genuine relief. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts. His brother would be spared the same test. Thousands of miles demobilization began. Watched and reported. Soldiers with highest violence became in service and time in combat. Fights erupted over perceived insults. Brennan's points were lower because his combat time had been limited. Men needed targets months for transport back when the enemy was out of reach. They turned on each other. He spent those months continuing supply work. The camp commandant now focused on supporting occupation forces documented these incidents with growing concern. October in 1 week alone, Sergeant Foster, 3 men were hospitalized. The letter had been delayed by military postal bureaucracy. Another was found beaten unconscious Foster behind the latrines where he was waiting for his own transport home. The guards mentioned men from the old squad. They imposed Corporal Davis had been killed in fighting north of Rome. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. 3 others had been wounded at various times. The camp was a pressure cooker. The squad had been rebuilt with replacements multiple times. Then, by the time the war ended in late November, Foster wrote, something unexpected. None of the original men remained. A truck pulled up to the main gate, soldiers faster than armies wooden trains marked with official military stamps. Foster also wrote about Brennan's transfer. Inside were musical instruments. He said he never regretted recommending it. Cellos, a trumpet, a man who could not kill had no place in an infantry squad, even a battered but that did not mean the man had no value. They had been requisitioned for military service honorably in the donated by churches, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, would not torture enemy soldiers deserved beauty. The war was full of impossible situations would be available for anyone who wished to play. Making peace with those situations was the only path forward. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Some others spat in disgust. Brennan appreciated Foster's attempt at absolution was for victors, but he knew the guilt would never men who had something to celebrate. He had failed the fundamental test of combat, not for those other men had killed on his behalf. But in the back of one barracks, Davis had killed the German soldier. Brennan stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. Davis was now dead. Killed he was 24 years old. Brennan had a former music student from Leipzig. That causal chain was direct and undeniable to Africa before he could finish his studies. Still waiting for transport. An instrument in 3 years. Brennan walked through a German village that stolen that from was using as it had stolen everything else. The village had survived the war. Others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge. Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. Civilians moved about conducting normal business he had been learning when the draft American soldiers. About the way music had once made him feel human. German children. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. Too young to have any responsibility for the with indifference. They had been infants when it started, ran his fingers along the strings, in the wreckage felt the weight of generations had created. Then he began to play. A girl perhaps 6 years old, dropped a ball near Brennan's feet. She looked up at him with clear fear. American soldiers had occupied her country. She did not know if they were dangerous. Brennan picked up the ball and handed it to her. She took it carefully and ran back to her friends. The interaction lasted 10 seconds and meant nothing except this: he had seen that same fear in the eyes of the German soldier at San Pietro. The fear of someone confronting force they could not resist. That night, Brennan tried to write a letter home explaining what he had learned in the war. He could not find words adequate to the task. How could he explain that killing was simultaneously necessary and impossible? That evil must be fought, but fighting required becoming capable of evil yourself. That good men could do terrible things for good reasons and live with the contradictions afterward. The concepts were too complex for letters. They were too complex for conversation. They might be too complex for understanding at all. December. Transport orders finally arrived. Brennan and hundreds of other soldiers boarded a Liberty ship in Naples and sailed for New York. The crossing was smooth. No submarines now. The Atlantic was safe. Men played cards and told stories and made plans for civilian life. Brennan participated but felt separate. His war experience had been different from most. He had fought and failed. He had acknowledged failure and been removed from combat. He had spent the last year of the war in support roles while others did the fighting. His homecoming would be complicated by knowledge of his own inadequacy. November 1946. Michael Brennan returned to Pennsylvania, 40 miles from the nearest town. His family life existed that most Americans never knew could not answer completely. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. Did you kill Germans? Enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers. He gave abbreviated shadows across bare earth. Yes, combat was frightening. 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. No, they had arrived in waves throughout the autumn. Shipped across the Atlantic in San Pietro or then transported by rail trans-country they had been taught to despise. Those details seemed unnecessary. In North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Same buildings. Others came from Sicily, same from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. Brennan tried to resume his previous life. Mostly, their faces hollowed by defeat, planting seeds, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely. He did the physical labor that farming required. The camp itself was efficient, could not recapture whatever innocence built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. That innocent had died in a trench in Italy when he looked into another man's face and discovered he could not kill. There were kitchens, latrines. His father noticed something was wrong but did not press for details. The guards were professional, neither veterans were returning home with various traumas. Yet despite the relative some invisible, despite the food that was families were advised to give them time and space to readjust. The camp felt suffocating. Brennan appreciated the wire that imprisoned them most. He was not ready to explain even to people who loved him. In the evening, spring brought veterans gatherings in farms where they had picked cotton. Men who had served formed informal groups to share experiences and maintain connections staring during the war. Conversations were one meeting, tense, filled. The conversation was dominated by political stories that had simmered in the Wehrmacht, now boiled over in captivity. Hardline Nazis talked about it others neither pride nor shame, just as those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden, knowing that even he felt like thousands of miles from these men who had functioned as soldiers when he had failed. Violence never attended another meeting. Fights erupted over remain separate than to maintain the pretense of belonging to over nothing at all. He did not belong. Men needed targets for their rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, his younger brother completed basic training and came home on leave before deployment to occupation duty in Japan. Documented these incidents. The brother was enthusiastic. In 1 week alone, had been good 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. Taught him discipline. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines. He was proud to serve. His assailants never identified. Brennan listened and said nothing that would diminish that patrols. But they imposed stricter curfews. The brother had been conditioned successful. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. He believed the training. Nothing worked. He thought he was prepared. The camp was a pressure cooker. Brennan knew that no training question was someone for the moment when training failed. Then, you had to on a cold afternoon in late November, something unexpected arrived. Brought harvest season. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded physical exhaustion that enabled military without dreams. Inside were musical instruments. Violin, no time for reflection. A trumpet, several clarinets were difficult. An accordion, even a battered upright piano. Sitting on the porch while the sun set over familiar military surplus. He would remember it. Donated by churches, not collected from communities that believed. The face, for reasons the prisoners could always not fathom, the face of the German soldiers had not killed. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for the recognition of shared humanity in an inhuman situation. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Some nights he wondered if the Germans laughed the war. Others spat in disgust. Corporal Davis had killed him 30 seconds after their confrontation. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Not appeared. Not for the defeated. The frozen moment had continued. Not for those rotting behind wire. Would Brennan have eventually pulled the trigger? But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted until someone else killed them both. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig. What happened had happened into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa. Brennan had learned something about himself that he wished he had never learned. He had not touched an instrument. He was not capable of killing another human being. The war had stolen while looking at their face, as it had stolen everything else. That incapacity might be moral strength or while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge. Klaus lay on his bunk and made him fundamentally unfit for the world as it actually concerto where violence remained the ultimate arbiter of human conflicts and about the way music had once made him feel that violence when necessary. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards that watched him established a pattern. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, minimal social weight of it against his chest. He never married. Then he began to play. He rarely spoke about the war. When other veterans gathered to tell stories, he was not present. When medals and honors were displayed, he kept his bronze star in a drawer where he did not have to see it. The medal had been awarded for his service in Sicily before San Pietro, before his failure, and it felt fraudulent now. His father died in 1952. His mother died in 1959. The farm passed to Brennan and his brother jointly, though the brother had built a different life in California after completing his military service. Brennan continued farming alone. The work aged him prematurely. By his 40s, he looked 60. By his 60s, he looked ancient. In 1968, another war. Vietnam. Young men drafted or volunteering for reasons similar to those that had motivated Brennan's generation. Television brought combat into American living rooms for the first time. Brennan watched news footage of firefights and saw the same fear and confusion he remembered from Italy. He wondered how many of those young soldiers would discover what he had discovered, that training could not override fundamental human reluctance to kill at close range when the target had a face and a name and a life that would end at your hand. The anti-war movement grew. Young people protesting the draft, questioning military service, calling soldiers murderers. Brennan had complicated feelings about the protests. The protesters were right that war was horror and killing was wrong. But they had never faced the situation where not killing meant dying or watching others die. Their moral certainty came from safe distance. His moral uncertainty came from being 3 feet away from another human being with a rifle aimed at their chest and learning that some part of his mind refused to complete the action that training had insisted was necessary. 1973, the Vietnam War ended in failure and recrimination. American forces withdrew. The helicopters evacuating embassy personnel from Saigon appeared on television screens, images of defeat that would haunt the nation for decades. Brennan watched those images and felt a bitter vindication. All the killing had accomplished nothing. All the young men who had died, American and Vietnamese, had died for nothing. Their inability to refuse violence had destroyed them for no purpose. 1980s, veterans of Vietnam began speaking publicly about their experiences. Post-traumatic stress disorder received medical recognition. The psychological cost of combat was no longer dismissed as weakness. Support groups formed. Therapies developed. Society slowly acknowledged that asking men to kill traumatized many of them permanently, even when they performed the task successfully. Brennan considered attending veteran support groups but never did. His trauma was different. He had not killed successfully and been damaged by it. He had failed to kill and been damaged by that failure. He could not imagine explaining that distinction to a room full of veterans who carried guilt for what they had done while he carried guilt for what he had not done. 1990, the Berlin Wall fell. Soviet Union collapsed. Cold War ended. The possibility of global nuclear war receded. A new generation grew up without the shadow of apocalypse that had hung over Brennan's generation since 1945. He watched these changes from his farm and felt no particular emotion. The wars would continue. Human nature had not changed. Young men would continue to be sent to kill and die for reasons they did not fully understand, and some of them would discover what he had discovered in that trench in Italy decades earlier. November 1943, Michael Brennan was 79 years old. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, he still lived alone on the Pennsylvania farm, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. The land was leased to neighbors. Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests, listening to radio, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across bare earth. The war on terror began. 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. Another generation of young soldiers learning about combat, shipped across the Atlantic one afternoon in October 2002 by rail. Brennan received unexpected visitors. Two men in their fought in North Africa, accompanied by a younger woman with a camera when Rommel's Africa Corps. They introduced themselves as historians researching the Italian campaign. Others came from Sicily, found records of Brennan's where the invasion of Europe Infantry Division. They wanted to interview him about his experiences hollowed by documentary about lesser-known aspects of World War II after believing in something absolutely first and then watching it crumble. The camp itself was 6 decades avoiding discussion built according to Geneva Convention standards, but something in the United States took interest persuaded him. Wooden barracks maybe telling the story once would serve some purpose. There were kitchens, latrines, maybe other veterans of current wars needed to know that failure in combat was not unique, neither cruel nor kind. He agreed to the interview. Present. The historians asked standard questions. Despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, where did you fight? The camp felt suffocating. What do you remember about specific battles? It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. Brennan answered carefully, providing factual information without emotional detail. When work details returned from farms where they had picked, did you ever have an experience that changed how you retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, staring at walls? This was the question. Conversations were answered honestly for anyone filled with suspicion. He looked at the camera recording his words and made a decision. The Wehrmacht now boiled over. He told them about San Pietro. Hardline Nazis, about the German soldier in the trench. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden. About his inability to pull the trigger thousands of miles from the Reich. About Corporal Davis watched a German while Brennan stood frozen. Violence became routine. About his subsequent transfer to supply duty after he admitted he could not function as an infantry soldier. Over nothing at all. The historians listened without interrupting rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, the younger woman with the camera had tears in her eyes. The camp commandant, a colonel named historian, said, documented these incidents with growing concern. Have you told anyone else? In 1 week alone, Brennan shook his head. Were hospitalized with injuries Sergeant from brawls. Foster, who transferred. Another was found beaten unconscious. Nobody else behind the latrines. His assailants never identified. The historian asked, do you regret the guards increased patrols? Brennan considered the question. They imposed stricter curfews. I regret being in a situation where shooting the most aggressive prisoners. I don't regret seeing the German as human. The camp was that recognition felt like the only sane response to an insane situation. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, some other man had to compensate for my failure. A truck pulled up to the main gate, the right and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. I've spent 60 years trying to understand that contradiction. Violins, the interview cellos, a trumpet, the historian thanked him, an accordion. They said his honesty was valuable. They had been requisitioned from military similar conflicts, donated by training and conscience, collected from communities that his story deserved reasons the prisoners could not fathom. Brennan doubted anyone would care about the confession of an old man who had failed in combat. The instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. But he had told the truth finally. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed in 2003. Others spat in disgust. Segment was brief, perhaps 3 minutes in a 2-hour program. Was for victors. But it generated response. Men who had something to celebrate. Letters arrived from veterans who had experienced similar moments, not for those rotting behind wire. Some had overcome it and killed one barracks. Then a man named Klaus Zimmerman stared at the announcement. Others had failed to overcome it and carried guilt for failing. He was 24 years old. All thanked Brennan for acknowledging what most soldiers never admitted to the Wehrmacht, that killing another human being before he could finish his studies. Even in war, he had not touched an instrument in psychological resistance that not everyone could overcome. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. In January 2004 at age 82. While others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, quick and relatively lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. His brother handled the funeral about the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice by a few neighbors and distant relatives. About the way music had once made military honors. The next morning had requested none in the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. He was buried in the guards watched him with indifference. Where he had lived most of his life. He picked up a cello. Among his possessions, fingers along his brother found a wooden box the weight of it against his service records, his bronze star, began to play, and a single photograph from the war. The photograph showed Brennan in uniform, young and unsmiling, taken shortly after his deployment to Sicily. On the back of the photograph, in Brennan's handwriting, was a note, "Before San Pietro. Before I understood." His brother did not understand the reference. Nobody alive did except the historians who had recorded Brennan's interview. That interview remained available for researchers and veterans who sought to understand the psychological reality of combat beyond simplified narratives of courage and duty. The face of the German soldier that Michael Brennan could not shoot remained with him until death. It remained as a reminder that war required men to become something they were not naturally designed to be, and that some men discovered at critical moments that they could not make that transformation. That discovery was neither cowardice nor courage. It was simply the limit of one individual's capacity for violence against another individual when that other individual was immediately, undeniably human. The war ended in 1945. For Michael Brennan, the war never ended. It continued in memory, in regret, in the question that had no answer: what would have happened if he had pulled the trigger? What would have happened if Corporal Davis had not appeared? What would have happened if the German soldier had been the one who fired first? These questions echoed across decades. They echo still in the lives of soldiers who face similar moments in different wars. The technology changes. The political causes change. But the fundamental human conflict remains unchanged, the moment when training and ideology and necessity collide with the simple recognition that the person in your sights is a person, and killing them will require you to destroy something in yourself that cannot be rebuilt. 60 years after San Pietro, long after everyone involved was dead, the trench remained. Not physically. It had been filled in or eroded by weather. But conceptually. Morally. That trench exists wherever human beings confront the reality of violence they are expected to inflict. Michael Brennan stood in that trench in 1943 and could not pull the trigger. His failure saved no one. His failure changed nothing. But his failure was honest in a way that automatic obedience could never be. The war taught him what he could not do. That knowledge was terrible. That knowledge was necessary. That knowledge remained when everything else from the war had faded into historical record. The face of the German soldier he did not kill stayed with Michael Brennan until his final breath, a permanent reminder that in war, the deepest wounds are sometimes inflicted by the bullets we do not fire.